said they were going to come, ordered a lunch. They don't show up, we can all have a second sandwich. But when we get to that point, we want to honor those who have come on time here and make sure we have enough time for our speaker. I'm Pastor Jim Deacon, Pastor of Hope Lutheran Church and Student Center. Welcome to all of you, especially those who come all the way over from the other side of the Potomac from McLean. They said they saw the advertisement in the Washington Post, which delighted me because that tells us that it actually worked, at least for some folks. But one of my favorite, well actually my favorite theological journal is called Christian Century, and I read that faithfully whenever it comes from cover to cover. And well over a year ago now, I saw this little blurb in there from a group from the Templeton Foundation that was soliciting grants from congregations to study the interplay of faith and science, and that they are not mutually exclusive. They were pretty clear, you know, if you're a bunch of creationists, you don't need to apply. If you're a bunch of scientific folks who think, well, God's a myth, well, you don't need to apply. They wanted people who were going to take this question seriously, and they wanted it done in congregations. And as a result, they said to apply for this grant, you had to have a pastor that was going to be involved in it, and a layperson who was somehow either a scientist, her or himself, or involved as a science teacher or something like that. So they invited grant requests, and so by the time I saw it, there wasn't much time for us to put our grant request together, but a bunch of people here got excited about it because we're right here by a great research university, the University of Maryland. So we put together a grant and we thought, well, maybe we won't get it, but it's a good experience just to apply. Well, lo and behold, we were one of 43 congregations all across the United States and only 4 Lutheran churches in the entire evangelical Lutheran Church in America that got a grant. Here's some of the folks we were waiting for. Come on in, we just started with intros. So anyway, one of the things we said we would do was we studied for a whole year in our adult Bible class using the Revised Common Lectionary. We looked at the texts of the day and we thought if you're somebody with a scientific mind or questioning, if you heard some of these stories like Jesus walking on the water, you'd say, you know, could that have happened? And how do we think about that? And so those are all posted online on our website. Our wonderful web master is here, Liz Dorsey. So she faithfully put those online. They're all on PDF. They're just a summary of our conversation. But if anyone in their home church wanted to take those, and we did it for a whole year, I doubt very many congregations would commit that much time to it, but that was our grant. So we did. But you could take from those and create your own adult class, or just read them to your own journal. They're all PDFs. And then the other big thing we said we would do was have a forum on faith and science at the University of Maryland. So this is the brochure from that. And that was pretty darn successful. All of us who were there thought it was great, but unfortunately not as many people came out as we hoped would. But we got done with this, which is, those were the 2 main things we said we'd do for our grant. You know, here we're in the Washington area, we kind of use the Washington mindset pre-sequester days. We ended up with more money in our budget than we thought. So we've had 1 mini forum since then, and we invited back one of our speakers from our major forum, Dr. Rajarsi Roy, who gave another presentation here on a Saturday. And that worked so well. We still have money left, but they said, let's do another one. And you know, sometimes when you're in church, you know, we come together to worship, and then we get together at coffee hour, and we say, you know, how's the wife, how's the family, how's the dog, you know, and we have that kind of conversation. We don't really get much deeper, and we don't know about books. Well, about a year ago, or, well, not quite a year ago, Pastor Carmelo Santos and I were at the Bishop's Eucharist meeting, and I think I overheard him saying something about faith and science. I went, oh, you know, that's what we're doing, that's great. You know, we started talking about it. And then, let's see, back in February, guess who showed up on the front cover of our national magazine? So I put that to our group and said, let's see if we can find a time and invite Pastor Santos here to speak. He is a pastor at St. Mark Lutheran Church in Springfield, Virginia, and he also lectures at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. And his specialty is looking at pneumatology, which is our big fancy, you know, 50-cent theology word for a doctrine of the Holy Spirit, and asking about that and brain function and religious experience, sort of like William James and that kind of stuff. So he teaches a course at Georgetown on God in the brain. I believe that's his topic for today as well. So what we're going to do is have Pastor Santos give his talk, and then we'll take maybe a 10-minute, 15-minute break for using the porcelain facilities or getting some water. There's a men's room over in that corner and a ladies' room over there. Also, you can use the elevator right behind me here or the stairs to go up into our narthex, and there are also facilities up there as well as a water fountain. Then we'll come back and have a dialogue with Pastor Santos, conversations, questions, and then our lunch will arrive and we can continue to talk over our wonderful sandwiches. And did anyone not order one? If you didn't get an order in, we'll probably have some extras, and so no one should go away. So without further ado, let me present to you, Pastor, is it doctor as well? Reverend Doctor? Can I say that? Oh yeah, I don't have one to say that. Reverend Doctor, because this one didn't say that, so I wasn't sure I should say it. Anyway, Reverend Doctor Carmelo Santos.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm so happy to see you. This morning when I got up and I went outside, I had two thoughts immediately. The first one was, what a beautiful day. And the second one was, oh, nobody's going to go to the lecture. But I'm glad that you're here. It's always a pleasure to be able to share some of my thoughts and some of this research with a lot of people to see how they react to it and to see what questions you have that can help lead this research deeper. Further. First, let me make a clarification. As Pastor Jim said, I am not a scientist, such as scientists in congregations. I was originally trained as a chemist. I used to do organic synthesis in the lab, but I got tired of the smells and the loneliness in the lab, and I really enjoyed more working with people, and so I transitioned and went to a seminary in Chicago that focuses on the relationship between religion and science. That's the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago, the Science Center for Religion and Science. You're a graduate? Excellent. So my full-time job is, or my day job is as a pastor, as a father, and as a husband. That's my real full-time job. And then I teach a course at Georgetown University that I call God in the Brain. And it's a course for undergraduate students from all kinds of concentrations and majors. They are required to take 2 theology courses during their time there. And the idea is to introduce them to different aspects of religious thinking and theology. And what I try to do in this course is to help them understand what are some of the challenges, but also some of the promises of the interaction between religion and science, between theology and science. And the way that I introduce them to this dialogue between religion and science, in particularly between religion and the cognitive sciences, which are many things, if I read in this novel, Lying Awake. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this novel. It's a wonderful story of Helen, who becomes a nun, a Carmelite nun. And after many years of being a nun, all of a sudden she starts having these amazing spiritual experiences. And here is a description of the experiences. It says, pure awareness, stripped of everything.
Can we get maybe a little more awareness?
It's kind of hard to see. She's saying if we can get better resolution at some time.
One second.
Well, he's going to read it.
I'm going to read everything that is spoken, but I understand it is hard to see.
If the room were darker, it might show up.
Yeah,
He's just going to read it, Joe.
okay, if you don't mind reading. Yeah, I mean, we got so much, All right.
The blessing and the curse of technology.
Right.
Okay, so this is a description from the novel Lying Awake by Mark Sarson. Pure awareness stripped her of everything. She became an ember carried upward by the heat of an invisible flame. Higher and higher she rose, away from all she knew. Powerless to save herself, she drifted up toward infinity until the vacuum sucked the feeble light out of her. A darkness so pure it glistened. Then out of that darkness, no one, more luminous than any sun, transcending visibility. The flare consumed everything. It lit up all of existence. In this radiance, she could see forever, and everywhere she looked, she saw God's love. As soon as she could move again, she opened her notebook and began writing. And so the sister started writing about these experiences that she was having, and her books became bestsellers, and people were providing money for the monastery. Now the problem was that together with these experiences, she was also beginning to get migraines, really bad headaches. And so finally they decided to take her to the doctor, which she didn't want because she thought that was part of the spiritual experience, part of the suffering. But they took her to see a neurologist, and the neurologist determined that she was having epileptic seizures that were provoked by a little tumor that she had right behind her right ear, in the temporal lobe. And the good news was that it would be an easy procedure to remove the tumor because it was benign. But the problem was that it was likely that she would not have those experiences anymore. Because as the doctor explained to her, those were typical symptoms of that type of tumor. To see visions like the ones she was seeing, to hear voices, and also to write a lot, hypergraphia. All of those were supposed to be symptoms of that condition. So after much pressure and struggling, she decided to have the surgery, and they removed the meningioma, and together with the meningioma, also went the spiritual experiences. So she no longer had any of those experiences, nor the feeling that came with the experiences. And so the question then is, what is the relationship between the brain and those experiences? Were those experiences real? Were they just illusions? And now, I know I am a Lutheran minister, so I need to say that in the Lutheran church, we don't typically put much weight on spiritual experiences. We're more about the word and the sacraments. But we cannot ignore the fact that spiritual experiences are important in the Bible. And they do play a very significant role in the life of many of our foundational figures. There's, for instance, Paul or Saul's experience of the risen Christ on the way to Damascus. And in the book of Acts, it is described as suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? He asked, who are you, Lord? The reply came, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. And of course, that led to a transformation in his life, and from following the church, he became one of the witnesses and eventually martyrs of the church. So it was a very meaningful experience that he had. And in some places, he would even go as far as to say that the gospel that he was preaching, he didn't learn it from people, but that he actually learned it directly from Christ. So that gives a lot of importance to spiritual experiences.
Are we supposed to think the thorn in the flesh was really a tumor behind his left ear?
Well, some people have tried to speculate, and then they go back to Paul, they go back to the Prophet Muhammad, and they all start speculating, oh, they had epileptic seizures. Well, the problem is that we don't have the brains to examine them, right? And even if we did, we're going to see that it's problematic to just go from one to the other in such a unilateral way. And even Jesus himself seems to have had a spiritual experience that is described differently in different Gospels, but if we go to what seems to be the most ancient source in the Gospel according to Mark, it says that when Jesus was baptized, just as he was coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens torn apart and the Spirit descending like a dove on him. And a voice came from heaven, you are my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased. Now in the other Gospels, the other people also see this happening or hear the voice. But in this first version of it, it seems to be only Jesus that is having this experience of that. So can we call it a spiritual experience? Can we not? Does it matter if it was produced by the brain or not? We'll see. Now, regardless of whether you believe that these experiences do come from God or from some transcendental space, or whether they're produced by the brain, the truth is that they are probably linked to the brain somehow. I mean, if you do have an experience of God, it's going to register in the brain, at least according to what we know now in terms of the relationship between the brain and the science. Everything that happens is somehow mediated by the brain. So this is from the book on this discipline, Greg Peterson's Mind and God. And this is how he puts it. If religious experience is real, and if we are physical beings, we might assume that it will leave behind some telltale traces in its wake. But if the sciences can completely explain why and how religious experiences occur, some would argue that such experiences cease to be genuinely religious arising not from the actions of God, but from the activities of neurons. So that's the intention that we have here. If I go too fast, or if you have any questions, please feel free to interrupt or raise your hand, and I'll be happy to answer. So, can we then produce these experiences? If we can identify a place in the brain that is responsible for producing these experiences, where this experience is registered in the brain, or in the case of the sister that I just talked about from the novel, that spot where the meningioma was, where the tumor was, can we somehow stimulate that part of the brain and then produce those experiences? Well, some people think that they can do that. And as a matter of fact, I think you can go online and buy what is called the God helmet, and you can try it. You can try it on yourself. This is reporter Barbara Bradley Haggerty, and she wrote a book called Fingerprints of God, and she went to different researchers trying to explore what they were doing in terms of the science of spirituality. And so she tried out the God helmet that was designed by psychologist Michael Persinger. And it's basically the focusing of an electromagnetic field, TMS, the transcranial magnetic stimulation. And so it stimulates particular parts of the brain to create temporary lesions in the brain. And so in this case, it stimulates the right temporal lobe because that has been implicated in several religious experiences. And he's gotten mixed results. In some cases, people have claimed that they have heard voices, seen visions, but in most cases, people just feel a presence, like to their left. They feel something there to their left, and it varies. Sometimes they claim that it's something that makes them feel peaceful and happy, and then other times it makes them feel scared and terrified. In her case, she said she just felt, quote, weird.
She made me weird before they put on the helmet.
Okay, so scientists have developed several ways of studying these kinds of experiences, and I want to just mention a few. One that I'm not going to focus on in this lecture is called the cognitive science of religion. The focus of cognitive science of religion is more on beliefs, more than on experiences. And so it tries to use evolutionary psychology to understand how the mind is put together and how that helps the mind have religious beliefs. In some cases, they would say that the religious beliefs are a byproduct of the evolution of the mind, and it's more like an illusion or a delusion. Then on the other hand, there are people that would say that because of the minds that we have, we're limited in our understanding of all reality. And so it helps us understand why we anthropomorphize God, for example, or why we think about God in the terms that we do, because of the types of minds that we have. And so they vary a lot from the evolutionary psychology, from cultural anthropology, and the cognitive science. During the questions and answers session, I can talk more about that field, but in the interest of time, and to be able to focus on one, I'm just going to focus on the second one, which is the neuroscience of religious experience. Some people call it neurotheology. I do not like that name. And the purpose of neurotheology is to correlate religious experiences to activity in specific brain circuits or parts of the brain. But we should move away from talking about the spots in the brain, and the God spot, because the brain is more complicated than that, more complex. But there are particular regions that seem to be more involved than others during this experience. So this is what I'm going to be talking about. This message works. Okay. So how do they go about studying what is happening in the brain during spiritual experiences? What they try to do is to measure changes in neurological activity and or physiological responses of people when they're having spiritual experiences, or since that is kind of hard to spot the person when they're having the spiritual experience and then measure it, then when they are thinking about when they had a religious experience, like remember when you had a religious experience, or when they're engaged in some kind of religious practice, like speaking in tongues or dancing, or dancing in the spirit, doing yoga, meditating, things like those. And then taking measurements of brain activity and also physiological autonomic responses while people are having those experiences or engaged in those practices. And another way is also to find correlations between brain lesions and specific religious symptomatology, like the case that I began with of the nun. What are cases where people suffer injury to the brain and then they report visions, or they report hearing voices, or they report conversions. They were not religious, and then after the accident, now all of a sudden they're very religious. So it's kind of like a detective work, trying to bring the pieces together, pieces of the puzzle. So I want to focus today on the research done by these two gentlemen here, because they were like the pioneers, and there has been other work done afterwards. Some of their work has been criticized, other parts of their work have been incorporated, but I think it will help us to understand the field in general. And this is Andy Newberg, and this is Eugene Giaquilli, who's deceased. And Eugene Giaquilli was a psychiatrist at the University of Pennsylvania, and his hobby was anthropology of religion. And he was interested in understanding this link between the brain and religious experience. And then along came this student, Andy Newberg, who was studying to be a radiologist with a focus on the brain. And so together they designed a series of experiments at the University of Pennsylvania to try to understand what's going on in the brain during religious experience. So let's see how they went about it. And by the way, the very early results were published in this book, Why God Won't Go Away. They published a more academic version first, and I think it didn't sell well, and then they got Vince Rouse, a science marketer, and then they did really well. I'm going to pass it around. Okay, so how did they go about doing this? Well, first they need the toy. They need the brain scanner. In particular, they use a SPECT scanner, and there are several options. And again, during questions and answers, we can talk more about the details of that. But first, they need a scanner that can detect activity in the brain, changes of activity in the brain. Okay? Then they need somebody that prays a lot, right? Somebody that has religious experiences often. And so they chose Tibetan Buddhist meditators because they're very well known precisely because of their ability to concentrate, to focus, and to reach these levels of consciousness that are very different than the ones that we normally have. And then you take the monk and you stick him inside the machine. And then to make sure that you have a good sample, you also use some nuts.
You used to have to climb up a mountain to see them. Now you could just
Yes.
put them in the machine.
Yes. So let me be a little bit more specific on how they went about this. So, of course, these machines are very expensive, and they need them in hospitals for clinical exams. So this has to take place late at night, and they invite the monks or the nuns, one at a time, to go to a quiet room and to engage in the practice that they would typically engage in. In the case of the Buddhist monks, they would just engage in meditation, which meant that they would just clear their minds of all thought and then focus on their breathing and try to just not think about anything. In the case of the nuns, they would pray, and in this particular study, they would usually focus on an object, like the crucifix, and they would contemplate the crucifix. They would focus their attention on the crucifix. Now, while they're doing this, they have a string attached to their finger, and they have an IV line attached to their forearm. And the idea is that at the moment that they feel that they have reached the peak of experience, the moment that they feel that they have reached a spiritual level, then they would pull the twine, they would pull the string. And then Newberg and colleagues, falling asleep on the other room, they would immediately start the IV line. And so the IV line would send an isotope to the blood so that it would go to the brain, and then it would stay in the parts of the brain that are consuming more glucose. So if there's a part of the brain that is very active, it needs like gasoline, right? It needs fuel. And so if you can tag that fuel with something that you can then trace with a machine, with the scanner, then you can compare where there's more concentration of that isotope and where there's less concentration of that isotope. So it's a comparison. What parts of the brain are more active than others? It's not that those that are not active are not active. It's that they're less active, right? So it's a comparison. Okay? And so they did that with about half a dozen Buddhist monks and then half a dozen nuns. And the question then, they're very provocative in their titles. So one of the titles of their book is A Photograph of God, right? If they're a photograph of God, if they take a scan of your brain when they are in the middle of an experience of God. Of course, the problem is, one, that it is not a photograph, and again, we can talk about that later. It's really a construction, a computerized construction of signals sent from the brain, so it's not as straightforward as a photograph. And second of all, last time I checked, Buddhists don't believe in God, so there's a problem there. By looking at the brain of a Buddhist when they're engaged in meditation, you can see that. But let's go along for now.
Minor point.
So they asked them, what did you feel when you reached that peak experience? They interviewed them to understand what was the subjective experience that they were undergoing. And so they reported the characteristics of the experience most commonly reported by our subjects included senses of unity with the world, dissolution of the self, and intense emotional responses, usually associated with profound calmness. So it was this sense of being united with the whole world. They call that absolute unitary being, the feeling of being one with the world. Now, in the case of the nuns, it was a little bit different. In the case of the nuns, they reported two kinds of experiences. The first kind of experience that they reported was one of becoming one with Christ, not just with the world in abstract, in general, but with Christ. So Christ became the world, the only reality for them, and they were united to Christ like a drop of water or of rain becomes dissolved in the ocean. And then other nuns reported that they, after that, then felt a sense of unity with the whole world, so that it was no longer just of Christ, but it was of the world. So they went from one to the other. Now, what did they see when they took the scans of the monks and the nuns? What we're looking at here is we're looking at the cut of the brain, coronal cut. And so this is the front, and this is the back. And so what you're seeing here is the red color means a lot of activity. And remember, this is comparison. And then the more bluish colors, yellowish colors, means less activity. So what was interesting was that when they observed the brains of these monks and nuns, what they saw was actually a decrease of activity in the region of the brain that is called the superior parietal lobe, but that they call the orientation association area for short. And I will say more about that in a minute. And so they saw that when the monks were not meditating, but just sitting there, and of course they had to take a scan of the brain with normal activity so that they can compare it. And then when they compare it to the brain of the monk or the nun engaged in meditation, they saw that there's a decrease of activity in the parietal lobe. And they claimed that at some point it almost quiets down completely. At the same time, they saw an increase of activity in the frontal lobes, right behind the forehead. And that's what we brought this for. So this is the brain. So they saw increase of activity in this part here, and they saw decrease of activity in this part here.
And normally, what are the functions of those two parts of the brain?
Normally, the functions of those parts of the brain, in general, before I go to specifics, they call this, again, they're good writers, so they use provocative terms. They call that the seat of the will. So it's where we initiate action, and when we monitor the results of those actions, okay? And among many other things. And then that's the frontal lobes, and then the parietal lobes mediate our sense of embodiment, our body and the space in which that body moves. And we will see a lot more of that in maybe more that you want to know in a minute. Okay, so because I teach usually students from all majors, I never know who knows what about the brain. So let me give it like a general tour of the brain. If it's too basic, let me know. And if it's too complicated, let me know. But perhaps the thing that most people know about the brain is that it's divided in two hemispheres, and that the two hemispheres are known for specific functions that are different from each other, that complement each other. The dominant hemisphere, usually it's the right one, but the dominant hemisphere is usually considered to be in charge of holistic thought, putting the fragments together in the whole, intuition, creativity, art, music, and things like that. And then the left hemisphere, or the opposite of the dominant hemisphere, if you're left-handed, it's more involved in analytical thought, logic, language, and science and math. This is going to be important later because the process begins with the right frontal lobes, not the left. The right initiates, and then the left makes sense of what the right is doing. Then, if you take each one of those hemispheres in your hands, you can divide them into different lobes, and each lobe is in charge of a different function. And again, this is the brain works as a whole, but there's a division of labor. And so, in the part you're seeing, here are the eyes, and here's the back of the head. And so visual processing, at least the beginning of visual processing, happens in the occipital lobes in the back, but we're not as interested in that today. We're interested with the frontal lobes, right here, and then the superior parietal lobe, right here, we're talking about. And we're going to see why that is important in a moment. There was a neurosurgeon with a lot of free time in his hands during operations. And so I am told, and I have never seen this or experienced, but I'm told that often when surgeons are going to perform brain surgery, they prefer to leave the patient awake so that they can make sure that they haven't touched anything vital and anything that will do brain damage. And so before they operate on the patient, they have to make sure what is connected to what in the brain. And so through a long process, Penfield was able to map the body and the brain and to see, for instance, if I have an electrode and I apply current to this part of the brain, what happens to my body? When my finger starts to jump, then I can say that there's a correspondence between the two, a correlation between that part of the brain and the finger. I ask you to say something, and you say it. Then I ask you to say something, and I stimulate another part of the brain with the electrode, and then you start, then that tells me that that's not connected to speech. And so he was able to trace the body into a string of neurons in the brain, and this is what it would look like. proportionally in terms of how much nerve tissue is dedicated to different parts of the brain. So that is why the hands are so sensitive, right? There's a lot more tissue dedicated to receiving input from the hands than there is for receiving input from the arms. Same thing with the legs. See, so we have a map of our body in the brain. As a matter of fact, we have several maps of the body in the brain that are in charge of either receiving input from the body or sending instructions to the body. That is what you see here. The one that is closest to the front sends signals, and then the one that is towards the back receives signals. Okay, so what they explain that is happening is that part that we just saw, we have a map of the body. Tells us that the brain helps us create the reality of embodiment and of the space where the body moves. In other words, they say that the left hemisphere, that part that we saw with the body map, helps us in the left hemisphere helps us feel and determine what is my body and what is not. So it gives me the feeling and the awareness that this is my body. Now, weird things happen when people have injuries to those parts of the brain. Sometimes people feel that this is not my hand. I don't know why. There was actually a case of a patient who was lying in bed. He had an accident. He had injured some part of the brain. Woke up, and then he threw himself out of bed. And when they asked him what happened, he said that those nurses put a leg there, maybe from the ward, and he thought it was a bad joke, and he kicked it out of the bed, but it was his own leg, right? And so this is one of the more difficult parts to understand, how our sense of body, of embodiment, that we take for granted, it's a product of the brain. The brain is helping us create this idea, this feeling, this sense that this is my body. And so the left hemisphere is in charge of creating that sense skin there. And then the right hemisphere is in charge of creating the matrix where that body moves. So it tells me that I cannot reach that. I have to get closer so that I can reach that. So it creates the world, the matrix, in which my body moves and interacts. Now, what happens, they say, if all of a sudden I cut that part of my brain of all input from the actual body, which is what they said that, what they saw happen. So that part of the brain is still working. It hasn't stopped working, but it's being choked of sensory input. So no information is coming to what they call the orientation association area. All of a sudden, you're receiving no input. So when the monk is meditating, according to their hypothesis, when the monks are meditating, first they focus fiercely on not thinking about anything, right? So they're sending instructions to the rest of the brain to block out all sensory input. Don't think about anything, just block your attention, okay? Focus. And then that results in that part of the brain being choked of all input from the body. But it's still trying to create the body. It's still trying to create the matrix where the body moves. And so all of a sudden, you have nothing to work with, right? But so you're receiving no input from the actual body, which feels like you're melting and you're becoming one with a reality, right? And in the case of the nuns, they have only one reality they're focusing on. So in the case of the nuns, they are saying they're telling the brain, only focus on the cross, on the crucifix, and on nothing else, just on the crucifix. And so the crucifix becomes the only information that the orientation association area, or the superior parietal lobe, has to create the matrix in which the body is going to be, to orient itself. So the Christ becomes the only reality that she knows, that the nun knows. And then it feels like she has become one with that reality because she's not getting any input from the sensory input from the body. Now this sounds a little bit weird, so let me show you a little video clip that maybe will help clarify how this works, or at least again, technology is great when it works. So you have to try and guess how many passes the team in white makes.
But they have to do something, right?
Yeah, they have to move.
Flip the charts.
This makes me feel like I'm at home. It happens a lot when I'm teaching. I refer the class, just like I did here. We try it, it works, and then during the class.
It's a teacher, exactly the teacher.
Fantastic. Folks, so that's just the wine. There you go, right in the middle. Right before you, there
Cognitive dissonance for me. So this is similar to what you're doing when you're trying to read a book and there's in a room that is very loud and you're just trying to focus on the room and you're sending signals to your brain to block out other input. So I just wanted you to see how that actually happens, how the brain actually does that.
Yeah, but doesn't that matter?
Yeah.
What matters is the parameters that the observer is given.
Okay.
You're said to count the passes between the white team. You're not said to observe the entire area for any activity that may be out of ordinary with the passing of what the white team is doing.
Okay.
So if you were given a different set of instructions, we might pick up on a dancing bear.
Okay.
Does color perception have anything to do with that?
I'm sorry, the what?
Does color perception have anything to do with that? because I'm colorblind and I couldn't see.
Well, the image was really bad in this case, which is a shame.
But I noticed it showed like that Ishihara color as, or maybe it wasn't afterwards, it showed those dots with color.
Well, I've seen tests with Stroop test. Well, you have to read the name of a color and then say the actual color. I think I'm outside the frame.
You're okay. You're okay.
I don't know. I picked this video because I felt it was a way for us to experience how the mind can focus on some things and not others. I don't know if it's the same mechanism that the monks are engaging in terms of the brain, but I think that it's important that we realize to what level our brain is active in creating the reality that we're experiencing. And that it's not just that it's there and we see it as it is, but that we're actually unconscious in making choices. Our brain is making choices. In this case, we kind of cheated a little bit and we told it what choices to make. But the brain is making choices in terms of what to perceive, what not to perceive, what to focus on. Okay, so let me we already start with some questions. Before I move to the second part, let me see if there are any questions about what I said so far in terms of, yeah.
Well, the first part, I know you mentioned that was a novel. Was that based on any story or science or?
The novel itself is not based on any specific person in real life, but there's literature of neurology of people that have had similar experiences. And if you want to read a book that is full of similar types of strange things that happen to the brain, to the mind when the brain gets injured, a recent one is Incognito, The Secret Lives of the Brain. I cannot remember the author right now, but that's the title. But it's a little bit scary when you start reading all the things that the brain can tribute to perceive.
People link that at all to like the near-death experience?
It's connected, yes, it's similar. Any more? Yes.
Yes, please. On the parietal lobes, the right side showed a reduction activity, but there appeared to be an increase activity on the left side on one of these images. Between the lower portion on the left and the top portion of the parietal lobe, there's an increase in area. So what does that attribute?
I think I'll go into that level of detail, yeah. And, but they talk about how the lower part of the parietal lobe, do you see that increased activity or decreased activity?
On the right side, there's a decrease in activity. On the left side, there's an increase in activity in one area.
Increase in one area. So the question is that in the brain scan image that we saw, there seemed to be an increase of activity in the lower part. So maybe somewhere down here.
On the left-hand side.
On the left side, okay. And they don't comment on that specific observation in that image, but they do talk about that area theoretically, and they talk about the role that that area has in the feeling of what's real, in us determining, are we dreaming this? Am I imagining this? Or is this a real experience that I'm having? Is this real? Am I really here? And they claim that that part is connected to our assessment of what's real and what's not. And so it's interesting. I hadn't noticed that, but it's interesting that on the left side that part would be more active because apparently what happens in the dominant side then is interpreted by the other side. So what's happening on the right side at the level of feeling and emotion then is interpreted by the left side and weave into a story, so that we invent the best story possible to make sense of what's happening to us and what we perceive. And then that part endows that experience with a sense of realness. Oh, this is real. This is not a dream. So that's, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The process is not just cognitive, but it's also emotional, although that distinction is a little bit problematic, but let's keep it for now. And so this process of having this feeling of unity with the environment, of losing the boundaries of the self, also triggers the emotional centers, or some of the centers that are involved in emotions, the limbic system. And then it activates the autonomic nervous system, so that we have certain feelings attached to these experiences. So another counterintuitive thing about the nervous system, we know that we have the fight and flight responses. We know that we have a system that helps us relax, and we have a system that arouses us for action. Now, I used to think that that was like turning on the light or turning off the light. It's on or it's off. So if it's on, then I'm aroused. If it's off, then I'm relaxed. But that's not how it works. It usually works that way, when one is on, the other one is off. But as it turns out, they can both be on at the same time, or they can, so they can both be on at the same time. But first, let's see what each one of them does. When you have a quiescent reaction, that's the relaxation reaction, and you can see those in pupil constriction, stimulates flow saliva, slows the heart rate, and constricts the bronchi. So when you go home, if you have a bath or a hot tub, and you lay there and then you relax with some soft music, and you can feel that response. And then the arousal, fight or flight response, the opposite reaction, dilated pupils, stimulate sweat glands, inhibit flow of saliva, etc. So certain religious practices will activate one of those, and other religious practices will activate the other. So if you are sitting in meditation, then you're probably activating the more quiescent reaction, the more relaxation reaction. But if you are engaged in a rhythmic voodoo dancing, you're moving your body rhythmically fast, you're probably then activating the arousal. Now, what they claim, and let me remind you again that I'm reporting on the research of others. I myself am not a neuroscientist, I'm a theologian in dialogue with the neurosciences. And I take responsibility for being well informed and answering, but this is what they claim. They claim that there are 4 possible states that you can have from the autonomic system. One is hyperquiescence, where we're engaged in religious activities. One is hyperquiescence, and it's a sense of oceanic tranquility and bliss in which no thoughts, feelings, or bodily sensations intrude. So we already saw that one. It's just hyper, it's to the extreme. Then the opposite is hyperarousal, a burgeoning sense of excitement, keen alertness, and fierce concentration. Some people refer to this also as the runner's high, the flow experience, where you're just really fiercely focused on what you're doing. Now, what they claim is that one can spill into the other, so that if you have enough activity in the part of the brain, I believe it's controlled by the hypothalamus, but I don't remember exactly now. If you have enough activity in this part, in this system, then it can trigger the initiation of this system also, so that all of a sudden you have both the feeling of calmness and of alertness at the same time. So you're feeling relaxed and excited at the very same time. You have both. And so it can happen when you are so relaxed that it activates the arousal system, in which case it will be hyperquiescence with arousal breakthrough. And they describe it as when quiescent levels reach maximum, the arousal system can simultaneously erupt, causing an exhilarating rush of energy. Or it can be the hyperarousal with quiescent breakthrough, like Sufi dancers. I don't know if you've seen their videos. This trance-like state is experiences an ecstatic rush of orgasmic-like energy. So what they're claiming is that in addition to the feeling of oneness with the world or with the Christ, there's also a strong emotional response from the autonomic system. And that response will endow the experience with a sense of realness that is related to what we were talking about earlier. I'll go back to that. So this is a summary of what's happening. Via negativa is when the Buddhist monks are focusing on not thinking of anything, but just their breath, focusing on their breath. And via positiva is when you focus on something, when you are contemplating, and it can be the crucifix, but it can also be a word. When you are doing lecture in the evening, it can be a word, or it can be a sound, etc. And their claim is that via positiva can only last for so long because the brain gets exhausted, and then it turns into via positiva, turns into via negativa. So when you're contemplating the crucifix, you become one with Christ, but then the brain gets tired, and then it just spills over. It moves over to an experience of absolute unity with the world. And so they claim that that is the core experience of all religious experiences. And this is just a summary of what's happening. The attention area, again, just to summarize, the attention area in the front sends inhibitory impulses to the orientation area with the help of other structures. And there's going to be if you're very interested in this, I'll give you how to access a scheme, not a scheme, a scheme, a chart. Then the orientation association area, which creates the feeling of the body and its matrix, gets show of input, so it generates a boundless self. And then the limbic system activates quiescent and arousal responses. And then again, later, if you want to see more details of what structures in the brain are involved, I can email this to you, or you want to access these charts. Okay, so here they then are faced with the question of what is it that these people are experiencing when they have these experiences. And so here is where things get tricky, when all of a sudden the scientist becomes a philosopher, the neurologist becomes a theologian. So their interpretation is the following. They say, in absolute unitary being, nothing is experienced but the pure and complete unity of all things, or of no things. They're borrowing language from the mystics of different traditions. One thing cannot stand apart from another. So individual beings and objects cannot be perceived. The egotistical self cannot exist because it has no non-self against which to define itself. In the same fashion, God cannot be set apart from his ultimate oneness as an identifiable, personalized being. To do so would be to conceive of a God who is less than absolutely real. All personalized incarnations of God are rooted in the perception of a larger reality, the deepest, most sublime sense of realness the mind is able to experience. So what they're claiming is that, first of all, the experience is real, so they have vindicated mystics, and I'm going through their arguments. They have vindicated mystics because, first, they're not lying. When they say that they have these experiences, they really have these experiences. And second, because we can find a mechanism in the brain for them, or we can see actual changes in the brain, then at least at the neurological level, they are real experiences. So that's the first thing that they're saying. Then the second question that they're asking is, they asked the question of evolutionary theory and why would our brains be capable of doing that? And they say that this is the same or similar system for sexual intimacy and orgasm, and that it helps people, partners, to feel closer to the other. And so that in the same way that certain structures went from being, I forget now, so the bird did not develop wings to fly, but once it developed wings, then it felt it was able to fly, and it was able to fly. In the same way, we develop evolutionarily the ability in our brains to engage in these experiences And then we kind of stumble upon higher reality. And this is the third step then of their claim. And the third step is that the experience is real, and it is an experience of a higher reality. And they say that that these mystics are being able to experience a deeper reality than the one that we see every day, and that reality has to do with the unity of everything. So that the distinction between you and me is an illusion. In reality, we are all connected. And they claim that when we're having that experience, or when the mystics are having that experience, it is just an experience, a feeling. And then afterwards, when you get back to normal, they do interpret the experience with the language that you have, with the cultural categories that you have, with the religious categories that you have. And then that's where you get the distinctions between Vishnu and between Christ and between Buddha, etc., etc. And so they're trying to claim that this will allow for unity among different religions, because there is a root experience that is true, and that God transcends all those languages, all those words that we use to describe God. So that's their claim. That's what they make of this research. Now, of course, the other option is that it could be an illusion. How can you distinguish between a hallucination, for example, and a religious experience? Well, first of all, they claim that hallucinations usually involve only a single sensory system. A person may see a vision, hear a disembodied voice, or feel a sense of presence, but rarely are multiple senses simultaneously involved. Mystical experiences, on the other hand, tend to be rich, coherent, and deeply dimensioned sensory experiences. They are perceived with the same, and in some cases, increased degree of sensory complexity with which we experience ordinary states of mind. And so if you remember Paul's experience, or Saul's experience, it involved seeing the light, and it involved hearing the voice. So several sensory inputs. And then the same thing with the experience of Jesus after being baptized. He saw the heavens open, the God, and we don't know what they felt, but there are several senses involved. Second, when hallucinated individuals return to normal consciousness, they immediately recognize the fragmented and dreamlike nature of their hallucinatory instrument. Mystics, however, can never be persuaded that their experiences were not real. This sense of realness does not fade as they emerge from their mystical states, and it does not dissipate over time. So even great mystics like Saint Teresa of Avila, they warn against false experiences. And they say there are many experiences that your body will trick you into having. But then there are the real experiences with God. And so what they're claiming is that when people have those real experiences, or mystical experiences, they just feel. I mean, going back to how you know what's real, what's not, they just feel that it's real. And they use the language of it being more real than reality itself. And then finally, they cite different research linking religious experience to mental health. And for more information, you can go to the Handbook of Religion and Mental Health, and I think they just had a new edition out, and they list a lot of research in that area. But overall, there seems to be a positive link between, if not religious experience, religious practices with mental health. It's a little bit tricky because it depends on how you define it. If you define the experience of devils or demons as religious experience, then it's not good for your health. But overall, this kind of experiences of unity with the world, unity, seem to be good for health. So much so that there's a lot of research that is going away from the religious dimension of it and just focusing on the clinical dimensions of it. So regardless of whether you believe in God or not, can you access the benefits of meditation, of contemplation? And so I recently came across an article in the Washington Post that talked about this mindfulness and meditation training with PTSD symptoms. And in my own work as a pastor, where I have found this helpful, other than in theology, is in my work, particularly with patients that are near death, patients that are dealing with chronic disease or with cancer. In one particular case, there was a young woman with two young kids that she had cancer, and it was in her last weeks. And so what we did was we worked in helping her do century prayer and contemplative prayer as a way to manage her pain, the chronic pain and the anxiety, so that she would think of one word that would describe God for her, the goodness of God. And then she would focus on that word and then nothing else. And then just become one with the word. And she died eventually, but she conveyed that she had this sense of peace, and that it really helped with her pain. And so there are some centers in different hospitals that are working with that. And I would like to have you maybe experience a little bit of what I'm talking about. So let me show you this exercise. It says it's 3 minutes, and increase the volume.
It's going.
How can I get the volume up?
Is that the bottom line?
The volume.
Bottom line? Yeah, the bottom.
As part of a mindfulness-based cognitive therapy group class.
It says or.
Class. Taking just 3 minutes out of your busy life can often help you
Maybe I should just assign that as homework. I don't think it's going to be very relaxing if it keeps freezing.
Carmelo, you want to write the YouTube thing on the board there?
So that's or you can just go to YouTube and just type 3-minute mindfulness exercise, and it will do the. Are we ready to? Okay, if you're interested in learning more about the clinical applications of this type of research, or even research into religious experience, this is just a sample of different people that are actually engaged in this type of research. I'm going to say more about Patrick McNamara in a minute, so let's go over that. Mario Beauregard, he is working out of the University of Montreal, and he did similar studies in Newburgh and Yaquini, where he used Carmelite nuns, and he is working from a more evangelical perspective. And so he, in a more dualistic framework, so that he thinks that there is another reality than the physical reality that we experience. But he's a minority. There are very, very few neuroscientists that think that. And very few theologians that think that also, I would say. Nina Asari out of the University of Hawaii. Richard Davidson just got a big grant from Templeton also. And so he's engaged in how this type of practices, meditation and mindfulness, how they affect morality. So after a weekend of practicing meditation and contemplation, how would you respond to ethical situations versus people that have not been engaged in that type of practice? James Austin was one of the pioneers, even before I think Newberg and Yaquili. He was engaged in studying Buddhist meditation. He himself is a Buddhist, but he was using other methods than the ones that I described. And then John Kabat-Zinn, he is very popular in the positive psychology world, and he was involved in creating the Center for Mindfulness in Medicine at the University of Massachusetts. So one of the pioneers in using meditation to treat chronic illness. And then finally, there's the Mind and Life Institute, which is working very closely with the Dalai Lama, the head of Tibetan Buddhism. And the Dalai Lama has sent instructions to his Buddhists to make themselves available for this kind of research. And they can do some very amazing things, apparently, like modulate their body temperature through meditation, and things that are really amazing. So they will help us to understand better, if not God, at least the body, the human body, the human brain. Okay, so I told you that the research that I presented to you from Newberg and Yaquili was early. Now I want to very briefly tell you about the research by Patrick McNamara at Boston University. And what he has done in this book and in other books is some kind of meta research where he has tried to see different results from different experiments, different brain scan studies, and also different data from the clinic, so that he wants to see what I was talking about, injuries in the brain and how they produce religious symptomatology. And so bringing all that together and trying to ask the question, is there something that this has in common? And so he has come to the conclusion that, according to him, and this is controversial, that there is something that he calls the religious circuit in the brain. That there is a circuit in the brain that is dedicated to have religious experiences and to have religious ideas, cognitions. He says, although the range of variance in religious experiences across cultures and time epochs is unknown, I find that changes in religious experiences in the sample of subjects that have been studied with cognitive and neuroscientific techniques are in fact reliably associated with a complex circuit of neural structure. This, of course, is a remarkable fact. The fact that a particular circuit of brain regions is consistently associated with religious experiences may tell us something about the nature and function of religion. And I'm not going to go through this, but these are the structures that he talked about. And some of them we already saw. Actually, all of them we already saw, but we didn't focus as much. In the prefrontal regions. And most of the activity that he finds interesting is happening in, you could call it the human part of the brain, where the whole brain, it works as a unit. But an interesting coincidence is that, according to him, according to McNamara, the same structures that are involved in religious experiences, religious cognitions, etc., are also involved in the creation of my sense of self, not just embodiment, but of myself, of who I am as a person. So not just my body, but also the story that I tell myself of who I am. Okay? Did I see your hand? Any question? that part of the brain is also referred to sometimes as the CEO of the brain, although I don't like that type of language, but it's where the executive functions of the brain reside. So there's monitoring of what's going on. There's monitoring of what's going on inside the body, feelings, emotions, motivation, and then there's also monitoring of what's going on outside in the external world, and deciding where you decide whether to engage in action or not, and what to do. This is a fascinating part of the brain. It's closely connected to the emotional centers, to the limbic center. And it's a fascinating part of the brain because when you have injuries there, apparently it changes your morality in some cases. I'm not going to go into the details, but the most recent paper that I read about this is actually quite sad because it says that children in early age, I think it's from 0 to 3 years of age, if I remember, if they suffer injuries in other parts of the brain, like the language centers, they can recover. Other parts of the brain can take over. There's plasticity in the brain. However, when they study children with injury to this part of the brain, they often show symptoms of being psychopath, right? And of not feeling remorse for their actions, and with little change, in spite of therapy, in spite of counseling. And of course, those are always, a lot more research needs to go into that, but it's interesting the link that exists between this part of the brain and our souls, what we would consider to be our souls, right? The sense of identity of who I am. And so that is the part that Amara, together with what we just saw, calls the religious circuit in the brain. And of course, the religious circuit is always connected to neurotransmitters, and there's also genetics involved. And during the questions and answers session, we can also talk about some of those details. But some of these experiences can be triggered through mushrooms or other substances. And some ancient religions actually continue to, I think in some Native American traditions in Mexico, continue to use some of these substances to produce these effects. They found that there's a variation in the gene that regulates the link between this region and the emotional systems. There's a variation in that gene that when people have that variation, they seem to be more prone to have religious beliefs and religious experiences than those that don't have that variety.
The Presbyterians are right. Predestination.
Predestination, well, that's correct. So back to Madame, the claim is a simple one. A self, and by that he means our understanding of ourselves as memories, as feelings associated with those memories, etc. A self becomes more complex and more unified than the baseline, less complex self by obtaining control of a greater range of neurocognitive systems than the baseline self controls. This is what decentering accomplishes, particularly when it operates in religious environments. I find this funny because he said the claim is a simple one and then it's not. It's simple for him. But what he claims is that during religious experiences, you let go of your sense of self, as we just saw, but not just your embodiment, not just your body's sense of self, but also who you think you are. And you submit yourself, you subject yourself to a higher self. And it can be a saint, it can be Christ, an ideal self. And then by doing that, you are reorganizing at the emotional level your sense of self, so that you are using that as a model to reorganize your brain. And then the result can be it varies. When it goes well, then you have a stronger sense of self. You have more control over the different systems that are working in your being, emotional systems, bodily systems, etc. So you have better self-control of who you are. And he thinks that's the purpose of that circuit, of the religious circuit. When it goes wrong, you either choose a wrong model to let go, and then you can become arrogant, or if the process goes well, you never go back to it. So you have a broken self, and you can have experiences like demonic possession and other pathologies. And of course, those are big claims, and we can talk more about them. Now, the process, he calls it decentering, and decentering involves a temporary decoupling of the self from its control over executive cognitive functions, and a search for some more effective controlling agency over cognitive resources and mechanisms. The idea is that religious practices create a decentering effect that transiently relaxes central control, but that leads ultimately to greater self-control. Okay, so do you understand his claim, the hypotheses that he's presenting? And of course, he's engaged in research on this, and so if you want to get a PhD in religion science in this area, you can go there and study with him. This is ongoing work right now. And this is all hypotheses, right? They still need to be tested. Some of it will be right, some of it will be wrong. New ideas will emerge. So before I move on to some theological thoughts on what this all means, those that grew up in the Lutheran tradition, we have to study the catechism, and at the end of every statement, it always says, what does this mean? So that's why I like it, what does this mean? And we have to memorize that, what does this mean? So implications for theological reflection.
Can I ask a quick question here?
Yes.
I'm just curious as to whether or not any of these scientists, I mean, they studied the Buddhist monks and they studied the Carmelite nuns. Has anyone studied sort of the presence of evil? Like go into a prison where there are people who have been serial killers and then test their brains or something?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember, from a psychological perspective, there's a new book out called The Lucifer Effect by this psychologist that he designed a famous experiment where he divided students into two groups, and one group of students were to be prisoners, and the other group of students were to be guards. And halfway through the experiment, he had to stop it because the guards were abusing the prisoners were rebelling against the guards, and they were taking it really seriously. And I haven't read the new book, but he's a person. The Lucifer Effect is the title of that book. And I cannot think of anybody specific right now, but I do know that there's work done in that area. So it will come to me later.
But one thing that comes to my mind is Scott Peck, who wrote The Road Less Traveled. It was very popular. Everyone read it. He wrote another book that was never as popular because it's so heavy and dark. It was called People of the Lie. Because he was a psychiatrist and he worked with people, and he began as a theist but not a Christian. But the more he studied this, he became a Christian, and then he began to see that there were actually people. He didn't want to use the word demon possessed. I don't know if you've mentioned that a couple times, because people get all kinds of ideas about the exorcist here, and so he didn't want to get confused with that terminology. So he came up with his own, called People of the Lie, whose model is something negative and seemed to produce evil people. He had no other way to, and he's a psychiatrist, and you're trained not to sort of judge anyone, but so it's a very heavy book. It came out a long time ago, right in the 80s.
I have to read it. I just saw it in my bookshelf as I was on my way here. It's funny how we buy books, and I almost bought another book that I already had. I want to pass this one around. It's from McNamara, the one that I'm talking about. And the level of evidence that he presents is amazing. And it includes some cases of demon possession. And it's very dense. And again, these are all question marks. I mean, we're fascinated, many of us are fascinated by brain science and by the answers that it's able to provide to us right now. But we forget that it's really an infant discipline. It's growing really fast, but we're still at early stages, and because of the speed of the media, we want answers now, and sometimes what are preliminary results, like what I just said about the correlation between that part of the brain and pathology and psychopathy in children, that are preliminary results of an ongoing research project, but then that becomes the finding, and then that becomes almost like a scientific law, and it's not. But we don't want to go slow. We want the answers now. So that's a caveat. So what does I guess
In the early 80s, my wife had chronic pain, not seeing the previous wife, and she went to the pain clinic of Dr. NG in Georgetown, and they're going to teach her to block the pain. So the first thing they did was what we were talking about. They taught her to change the temperature of different parts of the body, and they made a thermal image so they could see that she was able to do that.
Did you hear? That's, yeah, it's amazing how we can modulate so many things in our body if we know how, if we practice. So, what does this mean for theology? Very briefly, how does theology engage with science? How do religion and science talk to each other? Ian Barber is a pioneer in the field of religion and science. He looks at the historical material, and then he proposes that there have been four ways, four types in which religion and science have related to each other. It's more complicated than that, but there are types to help us understand. The first type is conflict. So it will be basically, pointing guns at each other and just getting ready to eliminate the other. You can see that today, for instance, in the New Atheists, which is have you heard of the New Atheists? It's a movement that started after 9/11, where it claims that religion is really toxic, and we really need to get rid of religion because it's really moving people to do terrible things. And it uses a lot of the research that I presented, but mostly from the one that I didn't present, from the cognitive science of religion. I'll pass this book around, cognitive science of religion. To explain that religious beliefs and experiences are just like a glitch of the brain. They're just a delusion, and we need to get over those so that we can be rational beings and then start making a difference in the world. Their critique is not baseless. I mean, I think that they have some important things to say, but they see it as either or. There's the model of independence, which says, well, religion and science, they talk about similar things. Religion will do its thing, and science will do its thing. I heard an anecdote, and I'm not sure if it was from Faraday or Lavoisier, but about this very famous scientist, that he had a laboratory, and he had a chapel. And he said that whenever he went to his laboratory, he would lock the key to his chapel in his safe. And then whenever he would go to the chapel, he would lock the key of the laboratory in the lock, so that his faith would not mess up his science, and so that his science would not mess up his faith. So that's the model of independence. I suspect that a lot of students, like myself, when I went to study chemistry, but was very involved in the church, I suspect that a lot of us are like that. We just leave our faith on one side, and then we focus on the science, and we don't see any problems because we think they're just talking about different things. In theology, we could say that New Orthodoxy, like Harvard, they said, theology is about the acts of God in history, and science is about nature and other stuff, so we don't have to bother with that. Then there's dialogue, which is the school in which I was trained in, which is to say that science makes claims that are important to faith, and faith makes claims that are important to science, but they also have separate realms of investigation. And at this point, what we need to do is understand what the other is saying, so that we can then engage in conversation, maybe for better treatment of illness, maybe for building a more peaceful society. But at this point, what we need is dialogue. So as a theologian, my job is to explain to the scientists what is it that I believe in a clear way, and for me to understand what is it that the scientist is saying in a clear way. Not debate, but dialogue. And then the fourth one is integration. which is the idea that if religion and science are talking about the same world, they're talking about the same thing, eventually we should be able to create a single theory that is credible to scientists and believable to religious people, and it's just a coherent theory of the world. And Newberg, what I just presented, I think is heading in that direction. He thinks that neuroscience can help us to create that integration of theology and science, which is why I don't like the term neurotheology, because I think it confuses disciplines and methodologies in a way that we shouldn't do. Others disagree with me. In theology, McGrath has a 3-volume series called A Scientific Theology, and so he tries to do that from the perspective of theology.
Do you have a proposal for another name?
Yeah?
Rather than neurotheology, do you have a proposal for another way to talk about it?
Well, you know, what I do usually is I write neuro and then I snatch it at theology.
Okay.
And that way the distinction is clear and the relation is also clear. But I usually just talk about the neuroscience of religious experience. Now, what about God? Right? I named this with the title God in the Brain. And of course, that was originally to get students at Georgetown, but it's also the question, God in the Brain. And so, what about that? What about God? Is this all in our brain? Or is there a reality that we can say that these mystics are experiencing? Was the nun that I talked about at the beginning, were her experiences real? Was God giving her those experiences? Or was it all false? Now, I'm not going to show the clip in the interest of time, but first, Newberg makes the point that at this point, neurotheology requires us to attempt another level of analysis beyond neurological function, in which we explore the reality of the experiences in and of themselves. In other words, he has to move from neuroscience to philosophy and to theology, and that's what he does in an explicit way. And then they go and study the literature of the mystics from different religions and come up with their own conclusions. But it's important to realize that the neuroscience can only take us so far when it comes to these questions, and then we really need to engage in dialogue with other disciplines like philosophy and theology to be able to go deeper. Now, I find interesting that we make some assumptions that we don't examine. So a lot of my students, the moment that they realized that those experiences of the nun were being produced by the tumor in their brain, they immediately think that they were not valid, that they were not real. Not all of them. Some of them are very creative and have a way around that. But what I find interesting is that there are other, obviously not identical, but similar situations that even if we can trace what's happening back to the brain, we don't disqualify it immediately. And so one example that came to my mind was the movie A Beautiful Mind. I don't know if you have seen that movie based on the case of Dr. Nash. I think he developed game theory, a brilliant mathematician. And Dr. Nash had the ability to see patterns that nobody else was able to see. I mean, he was able to crack codes that nobody else was able to decipher. But the problem was that he also had schizophrenia. And so he was seeing visions that were telling him to do things that were terrible to his family. So eventually he goes through a series of treatments, and he gets medicine, a drug that controls the vision. So he no longer has the visions, right? But the problem is that he no longer sees those patterns either. I mean, he cannot do math anymore either. And I'm basing this on the movie. I'm also very aware that I'm talking about a human being that is out there, and I don't know enough about that, and I respect that. But the question is, why are we so quick then to eliminate the sisters' experiences immediately when we find out that they were linked to the brain, but we do not do the same with the map that Nash developed. And of course, we immediately say, well, because we can test his claims. If the map is right, then others are able to do it. But then that also tells us that we need another set of criteria to determine whether spiritual experiences are real or not, and what we mean by real. It is not enough just to say that because they were produced by the brain, then therefore they're not real. Because in reality, as we just saw, even our sense of body is produced by the brain. Our sense of reality is produced by the brain. And Neuroscience and Theological, they list a series of systems in the brain that help us create the reality that we live. But it's important to realize that it's not just mystical experiences that are produced by the brain, but everything that we know and everything that we experience and feel, it's mediated by the brain. There is no way of standing outside of that reality. Everything is mediated by the brain. And so we constantly make decisions of what's real and what's not. And then we also have to develop methodology to decide what religious experiences and beliefs are real and which ones are not. And again, in the end, it has to do with feeling. When we decide what's real or what's not, when we have a dream, or when I know that I'm here simply because I feel that it's real, but I don't know if it's a dream. I don't know if I'm going to wake up and have to go get to the lecture, right? And so the brain is constantly adding richness to the reality that we experience. Well, you're seeing here, can you tell me what you see?
The chalk painting.
It's a chalk painting, exactly.
It's a what?
A chalk painting. So this is flat. This is a person, but this is a painting. This is a drawing. And so the depth is produced by the brain. But it's not just that depth, it's this depth also that is produced by the brain. Of course, there's something there, but I experience it as depth because of the activity of the brain. So that means that our knowledge of God is also mediated by the brain. And so it's constrained by the structures of the mind and of the brain, which also means we have to be careful with idolatry, because we can attribute to God experiences that in reality are just flukes, are just strangeness in our brains. And again, when you read the mystics, they go into great detail, warning people to be careful with experiences, and actually to shy away from experiences. They say it is not good that your faith is based on these kinds of experiences. But if you have them, then this is how you can tell if they're real. And they go through different descriptions. Saint Teresa of Avila, she talks about, in her book, The Interior Castle, talks about going to the depth of the soul. And so she explains the different steps based on her own experience. And then theologically, we should understand experiences of God as icons, and not as idols. The difference between an icon and an idol is treated by Jean-Luc Marion, a Catholic theologian. And he talks about how icons always send our, when we look at an icon, we know that that icon is not the thing itself. The icon always points to something else. So our eyes always go beyond the icon. The idol freezes the gaze. The idol frames the gaze so that we think there's nothing else other than the idol. The idol is the thing itself. It's what it is. And so both with religious experience and with science, we need to remember that we are dealing with icons, so that there's always more. There's a surplus of meaning, a surplus of experience to what I am experiencing and to what I am understanding. The moment that I stop and I think this is the thing itself, I build an idol, and it's not helpful. Let's get over this one.
Now, what was that last slide that you just passed over?
This one?
That one, don't, no, go on.
Okay.
That one.
That one, okay, let's go to that one. So, the debate is not just about God, but it's about what it means to be a human being right now. And it has to do with, we said predestination. And that's a real big challenge that we have right now. One of the biggest names in cognitive neuroscience, Michael Gazzaniga, just came out with a book he's the founder of the field, of the general field. So the neuroscience of religious experience can be seen as a subfield of cognitive neuroscience. And so he just came out with a book where he basically argues that we're robots. But as he said, don't worry about it, just keep acting as if you really had freedom. Let neuroscientists worry about it. Because we need to have, according to them, we need to have the illusion that we have freedom so that we can function well. So we are robots programmed to think that we're not robots. And that's the debate, right? It has to do with who we are as human beings. And I think that's a theological debate. Perhaps even more, we're not more important, but maybe as a prelude to the question of God. It's the question of who we are. And so one option was presented in this classical quote by Francis Crick. You, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. And as my wife said last night when she read that, that's sad. It's a really poor vision of the human being. So,
By the way, that crick is the Watson crick.
yes, yes, he went from genetics now to writing on consciousness, yes. And so in philosophy, this philosopher, David Chalmers, he talks about the distinction between the hard problem and the soft problem. So the soft problem is what we have been talking about here. How do you connect ideas, cognitions, feelings to parts of the brain? So how do you map those on the brain? That's the soft problem, or I would say the easy problem, or it's not that easy. But then there's the hard problem. And the hard problem is, what is the mind? Or what is this thing that I feel that I call I, that it's me? What is it? And so the debate has to do with how you answer that question. So reductionists are in favor of what Watson is saying, and what Crick is saying here, that reality is composed of matter and energy, and that's it. That's all there is. But then there's this thing that won't go away. There's this thing that will go away that René Descartes, a French mathematician and philosopher, he went to a retreat and he wanted to know, what can I know for certain without any doubt? And then the answer that he came up with is, I think, therefore I am, right? Cogito ergo sum. That's the one thing that I cannot deny, that if I think, then I exist, I'm real. Now, he took it a couple steps further, and then it became problematic. He said, well, then reality is composed of two kinds of substances. Reality is composed of thinking substances, so res cogitans, things that think, and the other reality is composed of things that are extended, things that can be divided, manipulated, physical things. So that's the dualism option. The reality is composed of souls and bodies, or it's of spirit and matter, etc. And since I'm in this slide, I can finish it. That gets attributed to Christianity often, and to the Bible. That is what Christians believe, that we are a soul and we are a body, and then when we die, the body goes to the soil, and the soul goes back to heaven or to God or whatever. And this theologian, philosopher, Nancy Murphy, in her book Bodies and Souls, or Spirited Bodies, she goes back to examine those claims and looks into the Bible. And so she finds that in reality, when you study the anthropology of the Bible, the idea of the Bible of what it means to be a human being, you don't see that dualism. You don't see that dichotomy. You only see it when there's beginning to be contact with Greek thought. And so when the Bible when the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible got translated from Hebrew into Greek, in the form of the Septuagint, then what happened was that this play works the other way around. Traditore. The translator is a traitor because he betrays the text, because adds things that were not there. And so when the translators translated the word nefesh into the word soul or psyche, they not only translated one word into the other, but they also brought Plato into the Bible. And he was not there before. And then Plato's idea of what a human being is in terms of soul and the body and all that. And so that simple move of translating one word for the other changed the way that we have been reading the Bible for a very long time. And for the last 100 years, biblical scholars have become aware of that, and they talk about the holism of the Bible. When the Bible talks of the human being is made of dust and goes back to dust. The promises that God gives in the Old Testament usually are not about life after death, but are about blessings to your children, the children of your children, and to your people, to the community. And even in the New Testament, the emphasis is not on the immortality of the soul, so that when you die, then your soul keeps living on. But the emphasis is on the resurrection of the body. So that when Jesus appears to the disciples, it was important to him to show them that he was a body too. So that he eats. He says, I'm hungry, you have something to eat. He is touched. He says, put your hands here, put your hand here. And so the authors of the New Testament emphasize the embodiment of Jesus. And if there is eternal life, it's in the form of the resurrection. And so Jesus anticipates the resurrection, which involves the transformation of all reality. Because as an embodied being, I'm not just my body, but also the air that I breathe, everything. So there can be no resurrection without a transformation of the whole, a recreation, a new creation of the whole world. So the emphasis in theology then is to embrace a lot of what neuroscience is saying about how we are embodied, how our brains embody our understanding of reality, to embrace that as something that is actually going back to biblical roots. And that our understanding is that is the way that God has created us. There was an interview with Newberg that I was watching the other day, and he said something that is very interesting. He said it would be really strange for us to believe that we were created by a God, but that then that God didn't create in us in the brain any way to think about God or to communicate to God. So it is not surprising to see then that we have in our brain and in our mind the capacity to think about that. If you are thinking of it from a theistic perspective, from the perspective of faith. There are still some dualist theologians, but they are, at least in the theological field, I think that they are the minority. So there's still some there. Then I think that just to conclude, I think that theology not only receives insights from the sciences and incorporates them into theological thinking, but theology also makes a contribution to the sciences. One that I don't have listed here is that it helps science ask questions that maybe they have not thought of asking. Or it points to experiences, just like religious experiences, that perhaps science would not have thought of exploring. And so theology can be an active partner in a dialogue with the sciences. But then theology can also be prophetic. It can also be a critical partner in telling scientism, which is not the same as science. Slow down and be aware that science helps us understand aspects of reality in a really good way and in a really deep way. But just because you become really good at explaining this aspect of reality, it doesn't mean that you have explained all of reality. Don't forget everything else that is outside when you explain. Landon Gilkey, a famous theologian in the dialogue of religion and science, uses the metaphor of a fisherman that wanted to know what kinds of fish lived in the lake or in the village where he was. So he got a net, and then he spent a whole year just catching fish, and then making lists of their size, their colors, their shape. And then he came to the conclusion that in that lake there were only fish that were this big or bigger, but none that were smaller than that. Of course, he forgot the net. He forgot that his net was only capable of catching fish that were that big or bigger, right? And sometimes I feel that that's the danger. that we can point out to scientists if they're listening to us, if they care, that we accept what is being discovered, it's true, but that we believe that there is a surplus of meaning and of being in reality, and that there always be, right? Because we are, in a part because we are immersed in the reality that we're trying to understand. And as we saw, everything is mediated by our brain and by our mind, and so it's always contingent. Our understanding is always contingent. And this is very important because if we are robots, right, and if my behavior is predetermined by my brain and by my genes, then what does that mean for the law, right? For the ways that we write laws. If I know that children with damage to that area typically show symptoms of psychopathy, does that mean that I need to imprison them early on? And there's a movie about that with Tom Cruise, I think. I forget, but where people are sent to prison before they commit the crime, just because there was a system to understand if they were going to commit it or not. And this, you know, do you operate on the children if they have certain brain structures that are different than others? So it's very important that we are knowledgeable in terms of the science, and that we are also able to speak with confidence from the perspective of faith, those of us that stand in the perspective of faith. And there's a lot more, but I think that that's enough for now. So take a break and then come back to have conversation.